For 10 long Christmases, my name vanished from the Mitchell family table. No seat saved, no card in the mail, not even a call on Christmas Eve. They celebrated my sister with champagne and laughter, while the chair where I once sat stood empty year after year, like a silent witness to my exile. I am Clara Mitchell, the daughter my father called a failed experiment, the sister forgotten as if I never existed. But time has a way of carving truth from silence, and this Christmas, they will finally see the life I built from the pieces they left behind. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. Most years, I sat in a tiny apartment on the south side of Dallas, a paper plate with greasy pizza on my lap, scrolling through Facebook as the images poured in. My sister Victoria at the center of a long table, my parents Richard and Margaret beaming beside her cousins, raising their glasses, nieces tearing into wrapping paper under the tree. Laughter captured in blurry Candid's wine bottles, tilted sweaters with reindeer patterns, the kind of warmth that used to mean something to me. And in every shot of that dining room there was a chair left empty at the far end. It wasn't intentional, I knew. It was just where I used to sit. Seeing it there, unclaimed, stung worse than their silence. At first, I told myself it was temporary. Maybe they thought I was too busy, maybe an invitation had gotten lost in the mail. But the years stacked up, and the excuses I whispered to myself grew thinner until there was nothing left to cling to. The truth was simple, they had written me out, and the holidays only highlighted how complete the erasure was. I remember the first Christmas it happened. I was 24 working 2 jobs to cover rent and tuition. I'd gotten home late, too tired to cook, and dropped a frozen pizza in the oven. While it baked, I pulled up my phone and saw the first wave of pictures. My parents at Grandma Rose's house, Victoria, showing off her engagement ring. The family crowded around her like she was royalty. No one had thought to call me. No one had thought to ask if I had plans. I ate that pizza cold because I'd lost my appetite halfway through the first slice. The second year was worse because I knew it was coming. I didn't even buy groceries. I ordered delivery, left the boxes on the counter, and kept scrolling through the same scenes. My absence so total it almost looked natural. By the 5th year, I stopped checking altogether, but sometimes a picture would still slip through a tagged photo, a shared memory, and there it would be again, the chair. Empty, waiting, a reminder of who I used to be to them. I grew used to the silence, though it didn't hurt any less. There's a point where pain dulls into something steady like background noise you can't switch off. It no longer shocked me. It just sat there, a constant hum in my bones. One December evening, about 6 years into the exile, I was out walking after a late shift at a construction site. Storefronts glowed with Christmas lights, carolers sang outside the church on Main Street, and families passed me with arms full of gifts. I caught my reflection in a shop window, hair-tied back jacket streaked with dust eyes. Tired but alert. That was when it hit me. While they toasted another year without me, I was building something none of them could see, something that would outlast every one of those holiday photos. The thought carried me through the cold that night. Still, each December when the air grew sharp and the neighborhoods lit their trees, a piece of me would ache. It was a dull throb, but it reminded me of promises broken long before the dinners stopped. My father had once raised a glass at that very table and told the room I was a failed experiment. My mother had nodded as though it were fact. Victoria had smirked, basking in her perfection. They might have thought I'd crumble under that label. Instead, it welded itself to me, and every lonely Christmas since became another layer of steel. One evening last year, I found myself staring at an old photo someone had posted from Christmas Eve at Grandma Rose's. Everyone was there. Victoria, with her kids, my parents, aunts and uncles, neighbors even. And there, at the far end of the table, the same chair stood empty. My chair. It wasn't theirs to give away or erase. It had been waiting for me all along. But I realized then that I didn't want it anymore. That space had been the measure of my worth in their eyes, and I was done being measured by anyone else. So I closed my laptop, pushed the photo away, and wrote down a vow on the back of a grocery receipt. One day I'll have a table of my own, not borrowed, not begged for, not left half empty in someone else's house. My table, my rules, my family, whether by blood or not. And when that day came, I wouldn't be the forgotten shadow at the end of the line. I would be the one at the head, the one who set the plates, poured the wine, and chose who had the right to sit. That thought stayed with me brighter than any string of lights on a Christmas tree. It carried me forward through years of doubt, through winters of silence. 10 Christmases gone. 10 empty chairs. And a promise burning steady inside me: I will build my own. When I was a kid, I could spend hours with a pencil and a stack of paper sketching out houses that only existed in my imagination. Hallways that curved like rivers, staircases that led to hidden lofts, kitchens with windows so wide they pulled the sunlight right in. To me, it was magic, but to my father Richard, it was nonsense. He'd walk past the living room, see me hunched over my drawings, and mutter, "Pointless! She should be studying math, like her sister." Victoria was everything I wasn't. She was the star of our suburban Dallas high school. Straight A's cheer captain, the one neighbors bragged about when they stopped by. At family dinners, she sat close to the head of the table, soaking up compliments like sunlight. I, on the other hand, was the afterthought. At those same dinners, my place was way down at the end beside the little cousins, far from the laughter and toasts. Christmas at Grandma Rose's was always the same. A long dining room table filled with food wine glasses clinking, and everyone competing to share the latest news about Victoria. She made the honor roll again. She's headed to state with the cheer squad. My father would raise his glass proudly. My mother, Margaret, would pass around photos like they were priceless treasures. And me. If someone remembered I was there, the questions were polite but shallow. How's school going, still in art class? They didn't wait for answers before turning back to Victoria's next achievement. I remember one Christmas in particular. I was 15 and had worked for weeks on a drawing of a house. I'd imagined every detail: the sloped roof, the front porch lined with columns, even the way the light would hit the windows at dusk. After dinner, I pulled it out from my folder, held it up with a smile, and said, "I designed this. It's the house I want to build one day." For a moment, the room fell quiet. I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd see me. Then my father snorted, pushed his chair back, and said, "Dreams are fine, Clara, but a girl should be practical. Like your sister." The conversation shifted immediately back to Victoria's scholarship applications. I slipped the drawing back into my folder and kept my head down the rest of the night. My cousins laughed. Dessert was served. Victoria twirled in her new Christmas dress, while everyone applauded. I sat at the far end, tracing the outline of my house with my fingertip, feeling the sting settle in. That was the night I realized it wasn't just forgetfulness. It was deliberate. In their eyes, I was the daughter who needed to be corrected, the one who shouldn't waste her time. At school, it wasn't much different. Teachers praised Victoria in front of me, using her as a benchmark. "Your sister scored a perfect SAT. You'll want to aim higher if you want to catch up." Every comparison felt like another brick laid between us. But I didn't stop sketching. I filled notebooks with designs, folded magazine clippings into binders, scavenged scraps of wood from construction sites to build tiny models. My parents called it daydreaming. I called it practice. I remember sitting in the back of the minivan on the way home from church one Sunday, notebook open on my lap. Victoria was in the front seat, chatting about her plans for the next pep rally. My mother turned back to me and sighed. "Clara, you have to think about your future. You can't just doodle forever." I wanted to shout that what I was doing mattered, that someday it would all add up. Instead, I closed the notebook and stared out the window at the rows of houses we passed, imagining how I would have designed them differently. Every holiday drove the point deeper. The Mitchell family gatherings revolved around Victoria, and I was expected to clap along. I learned to keep my sketches to myself, to nod when someone told me I should study nursing like my mom or business like my sister. On the outside, I played along, but inside I carried a growing list of promises. That one day I would show them these doodles could turn into walls, roofs, whole neighborhoods if I wanted them to. That Christmas night, when my father dismissed my drawing, I went upstairs to the guest room, sat on the floor, and held the sketchpad against my chest. I couldn't stop the tears, but I whispered to myself, One day, this will matter. One day they'll see. It wasn't hope, exactly. It was more like a vow. I pressed my pen against a fresh page and started sketching again, darker lines this time, as if to etch the determination into paper. Years later, when the dinners stopped and the invitations vanished, I thought back to that moment often. The sound of my father's voice dismissing me, the way the whole room turned its back, and the way I clutched my drawing like it was armor. That memory stayed sharp, a reminder of what I carried, and what they never understood. I kept filling those sketchbooks, hiding them under my bed where no one could laugh. Page after page of houses that felt real to me even if they were invisible to everyone else. And with every line I drew, the vow hardened I would never stop. I would never let their silence erase me. I would keep building on paper until the day came when I could build for real. In the fall of 2011, I enrolled at Dallas County Community College to study architecture. To me, it was the first step towards something I had dreamed about since childhood. To my family, it was a humiliation. At Thanksgiving that year, my aunt leaned over the table and asked my parents how Victoria was adjusting at Stanford. Everyone clapped when my father said she was thriving. Then someone glanced at me and asked, "And Clara?" My father cleared his throat and muttered, "She's at community college." The silence that followed said everything. By Christmas, the whispers had grown louder. I overheard one cousin joke, "Victoria's going, Ivy Clara's going cheap." It stung, but I kept my head down. I couldn't afford to waste time defending myself. Tuition wasn't much compared to a 4-year school, but for me it was still a mountain. I picked up shifts at a coffee shop in Oak Cliff, wiped down machines at a gym until midnight, and worked the front desk on weekends. Most nights I dragged myself home with sore feet and ink smudges on my hands from sketching between shifts. Every dollar I earned went straight to tuition books or rent on the small apartment I shared with another student. Some nights, we split a single pizza eating cold slices while poring over textbooks. I remember one Tuesday in December, I closed the cafe at 10 p.m., hands raw from scrubbing espresso filters. I had an exam the next morning but stayed up sketching floor plans on napkins because I couldn't shut my brain off. Christmas 2012 was when the line finally hardened. I had convinced myself maybe things would change, maybe they'd finally let me back in. I drove to Grandma Rose's house on a quiet street in Garland, a plate of cookies balanced on the passenger seat. Snow flurries swirled in the headlights as I parked across the street. I could see the lights glowing inside, hear the faint echo of laughter. I walked up the steps, heart pounding, rehearsing what I might say. Before I could knock, the door opened and my cousin's wife stepped out to smoke. Her smile faltered when she saw me. "Oh, hey, Clara," she said. "I didn't know you were coming." She slipped back inside, and a moment later my father appeared at the doorway. He didn't move aside. "Clara," he said flatly. Behind him, I saw the table Victoria in a red dress holding a glass of wine. My father lowered his voice. "Tonight's just for family. It wouldn't be convenient for you to stay." For a second, I couldn't breathe. "I am family," I whispered, but he shook his head and closed the door. I stood there, the plate of cookies heavy in my hands, the cold biting through my coat. Through the window, I watched everyone gather around the table plates being passed, my mother laughing at something Victoria said. Nobody looked toward the door. Nobody noticed me. I set the cookies down on the porch, turned, and walked back into the night. My boots crunched against the frozen sidewalk, and with every step, the weight in my chest shifted into something harder. That was the last time I tried to show up uninvited. That was the night I stopped waiting for their approval, stopped hoping for an open chair. From then on, Christmas became just another day on the calendar. I signed up for extra shifts, volunteered to cover the holidays, anything to keep moving. If my family wanted to treat me like a stranger, I'd learn how to live without them. The decision wasn't made with anger, not then. It was survival. Walking back to my car that night, I stared at the glowing windows of Grandma Rose's house one last time. Then I pulled the door shut, started the engine, and promised myself I'd never stand on that porch again. In the spring of 2015, I signed my name on a loan agreement at a small credit union in Dallas, my hand shaking slightly as the pen scraped across the paper. It wasn't much money, not compared to what real investors moved around, but to me and the two classmates sitting beside me, it felt enormous. We pooled everything we had, every dollar saved from part-time jobs and summer shifts, and bought a sagging 2-bedroom house on the south side. The roof leaked in 3 places, the floors were soft with mold, and the front porch tilted as if it might collapse under its own weight. Most people would have called it a teardown. To us, it was the first chance. The day we got the keys, I pushed open the front door and the smell of mildew hit like a wall. Plaster crumbled when I touched it, raccoons had nested in the attic, and the wiring looked like something out of the 1950s. My friends groaned, but I saw past it. I pictured sunlight flooding through larger windows, hardwood polished until it shone, a kitchen opened up with space for a family to gather. We didn't have money for contractors, so we became the crew. I learned how to strip old paint until my knuckles cracked, how to sand floorboards on my knees for hours, how to balance on a ladder with a nail gun in one hand. Saturdays were spent tearing out rotted drywall, Sundays replacing shingles on the roof until the Texas sun burned our backs. I carried lumber across the yard, measured beams twice, cut once, then cut again when it turned out wrong. There were nights I came home too sore to sit, falling asleep on top of my sketches, with dust still in my hair. Other nights I stayed at the house until past midnight, flashlight in one hand, brush in the other, coating walls with primer that turned the gray stains white again. I kept a notebook where I redrew the floor plan, shifting walls to create an open concept, sketching where new windows should go. Neighbors stopped by to watch us work. One old man shook his head and said, "You kids are wasting your time. That place will eat you alive." I smiled and kept hammering. 6 months later, he came back eyes wide and admitted he hadn't believed we could do it. By fall, the house was unrecognizable. The sagging porch was rebuilt straight and strong. The roof no longer leaked. The floors gleamed with a honey-colored finish. We salvaged the original staircase, polished it until the wood glowed, then framed it with clean white walls. In the kitchen, we knocked down a wall and installed new cabinets ourselves, arguing over screws and hinges, until the doors finally hung even. The rooms filled with light from windows we'd installed with our own hands. On the day the realtor arrived, I stood in the living room and hardly recognized the space. Where once I had stepped over broken tiles and mold, now there was warmth, air, the sense of a home. Families came to tour it, walking slowly, touching the banisters, nodding with approval. A young couple placed an offer within the week. We sold the house for double what we'd paid. When we divided the profit 3 ways, my share wasn't enough to change my life overnight. It barely covered tuition and a few bills. But the check in my hand meant more than any holiday gift I had ever received. It was proof that the sketches filling my notebooks weren't just scribbles. They could become walls, roofs, rooms, where people would build their lives. I remember standing outside the title office after closing the November air sharp against my face, holding the envelope with the contract inside. For the first time in years, I felt taller than the weight of my father's words. He'd called me a poor artist, a failed experiment. Yet here I was with the deed of a house I had helped transform, and the profit to prove it. That winter, while my family gathered without me again, I sat at my small kitchen table with a single string of lights taped to the window. I didn't scroll through Facebook. I didn't look for the empty chair. Instead, I spread out new sketches ideas for the next project. My hands were blistered, my back ached, but my mind was racing. It wasn't just a house we had sold. It was the first brick in the foundation of a future they could never have imagined for me. As I folded the contract back into its envelope, I thought quietly to myself, one day he'll have to stop calling me a poor artist. One day the proof will be too big to ignore. For now, I kept that thought close like a secret I wasn't ready to share. The next project was already waiting, and I knew the work had only just begun. In December of 2016, I decided to try again. I dialed my parents' number on Christmas morning, rehearsing in my head how I'd say the words. When my father picked up, his tone was already impatient. "We're busy, Clara. Call some other time." I tried to wish them Merry Christmas anyway, but he cut the line. The silence that followed told me more than the words did. The next year, news reached me that my mother was scheduled for heart surgery at Baylor University Medical Center in Dallas. I left work early, bought flowers from a shop near the highway, and drove 4 hours straight. I walked into the hospital lobby clutching the bouquet, nervous but determined. At the reception desk, I gave my name and asked for Margaret Mitchell's room. The nurse hesitated, checked the notes, and then looked at me apologetically. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I was told only immediate family are allowed." "I am immediate family," I insisted. She lowered her voice. "Your relatives told us otherwise. I can't let you in." For a long moment I stood frozen. People shuffled past, the smell of disinfectant hung in the air, and my flowers already felt heavy in my arms. I asked if I could at least sit nearby, and she nodded toward a row of chairs in the hallway. I sat down, watching families come and go, sons carrying coffee, daughters holding bags of clothes, all of them waved inside. My name was never called. Hours later, a nurse finally approached and said I could go in for a short visit. By the time I reached the room, my mother was unconscious, tubes and monitors surrounding her. My father stood in the corner, arms crossed, not meeting my eyes. No one spoke to me. I set the flowers on the windowsill, pulled an envelope from my coat pocket, and placed it on the side table with money to help cover the bills. I whispered a few words to my mother, though she couldn't hear them, then stepped back. The visit lasted less than 5 minutes before I was ushered out. In the hallway, I caught my father's voice telling the nurse she was just leaving. I walked down to the parking lot alone. The flowers I'd carried all that way were already wilting under the hospital lights, the petals curling in on themselves. Snow had started falling lightly, covering the cars and sidewalk in a thin white layer. My boots crunched as I crossed to where I'd parked. For the first time, I understood this wasn't a misunderstanding or a temporary rift. It was deliberate. They had chosen to erase me even here in a moment that should have bound us together. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and sat with my hands on the wheel while the heater clicked on. Outside, the flakes kept falling, coating everything in white. By the time I pulled onto the highway, the envelope with my contribution was still sitting by my mother's bed unacknowledged. I didn't expect to ever hear about it again. In early 2018, I signed the paperwork that made Mitchell Design and Build official. It was just me and 2 people I'd worked with on side projects, all of us young and hungry, pooling what little savings we had to get off the ground. Our office was a borrowed garage space in East Dallas with a folding table and a second-hand printer. But to us, it felt like the start of something real. We began small, taking on houses no one else wanted. Moldy basements, sagging roofs, walls stained from years of neglect. I walked through those spaces and saw not what they were, but what they could be. Nights were spent drafting plans, days were spent ripping out drywall or negotiating with suppliers for discounts on lumber. We learned to stretch every dollar to make decisions that balanced vision with survival. By the end of that first year, we had completed 3 houses. None of us made much money, but we kept the lights on, and each project taught us something new. I learned how to talk to inspectors, how to manage subcontractors who showed up late, how to convince a potential buyer that the place we'd rebuilt could be their future. I learned to stay calm when the plumbing burst an hour before a showing, and to improvise when the wrong windows were delivered. From 2018 through 2020, we finished more than 10 renovations. The rhythm became familiar: buy design, demolish, rebuild, sell. With every house we improved. Our finishes got sharper, our timelines shorter, our reputation a little stronger. Word spread that we were reliable, that we cared about details, that we didn't just flip houses for profit, but gave them new life. I spent my weekends driving across Dallas suburbs in my old pickup, scouting properties that sat ignored with foreclosure signs out front. I kept a notebook with addresses, sketches, estimates scribbled in the margins. There were plenty of nights I fell asleep at the drafting table with coffee gone cold beside me. In 2020, a local paper in Denver picked up our story. They ran a feature on young entrepreneurs revitalizing neighborhoods, and there was my name in print, my face in a photo standing in front of one of our finished projects. I still remember holding that newspaper in my hands, the ink smudging my fingers, feeling the weight of what we had built. It wasn't everything I dreamed yet, but it was something solid proof that all the years of doubt hadn't been wasted. I knew my family would see it eventually, and they did. A cousin shared the article in the family group chat, "Man-san." From what I heard later, the reaction was muted. At least she found steady work, one relative had said. My father's only comment was, "Well, she finally landed a job." None of them understood that it wasn't a job. It was mine. The company, the risk, the responsibility, all of it rested on my shoulders. I set the paper down and let out a long breath. Pride swelled in me, but so did something sharper. They still saw me as a kid with sketches, someone lucky to have been hired by someone else. They had no idea I was the one signing the checks, the one holding it together when everything threatened to fall apart. That night I stayed late at the office, the garage door rolled halfway up to let in the evening air. I looked over the plans for our next project, a crumbling brick house near downtown Denver. I traced the lines with my pen, knowing this was only the beginning. Someday the truth would be too big for them to ignore. For now I let the sound of traffic outside remind me of how far I'd come and how much further I intended to go. By 2023, I had saved enough and built enough credibility to buy 8 acres of land just outside Denver. The lot sat on a rise with a view of the mountains covered in scrub and snow in the winter, but I saw what it could be. I wanted more than a house. I wanted a statement carved into wood, stone, and glass. The plans took months. I drafted every detail myself. An 8,000-square-foot structure with a vaulted great hall and artificial lake reflecting the sky, a library with shelves that reached the ceiling, and a garage big enough for the vintage cars I had always admired from afar. Contractors came and went, engineers debated, but I was on site every day. I walked the framing with my hard hat on, pointed out misaligned beams, argued about finishes, and sometimes picked up tools when deadlines were tight. When the foundation was poured, I stood in the mud boots, sinking, imagining the walls rising. When the roof beams went up, I climbed the scaffolding and ran my hands across the wood, feeling the weight of years of labor condensed in that moment. My crew had learned by then that I wasn't a client who disappeared after signing checks. I was there, sleeves rolled, voice sharp when things went wrong, calm when they needed direction. By late autumn, the mansion was nearly done. The chandeliers had been hung, the glass walls polished, the floors sanded to a shine. Outside, the lake reflected the cold blue of the Colorado sky, and the driveway curved cleanly toward the road. I spent long nights walking through each room, adjusting details, moving furniture, deciding where the grand piano should sit, even though I didn't play. December came, and with it, the first snow. I ordered a Christmas tree 12 feet tall delivered, and set up in the Great Hall. I strung the lights myself one evening, climbing a ladder again and again until the branches glowed from top to bottom. Standing back, I watched the reflections scatter across the windows. The night I finished, I poured a glass of wine and stood alone in the center of the hall. The air was quiet, except for faint carols drifting in from a neighbor's radio down the hill. The chandelier above me shimmered, the tree sparkled, and the house finally felt alive. For the first time, I let myself think of the past. All the Christmases spent staring at my phone, watching my family gather without me. All the chairs I never sat in, the doors that had been closed in my face. Now here I was surrounded by walls I had willed into being. It wasn't just shelter. It was proof. The feeling that rose in me wasn't gentle. It was sharp, almost electric, part triumph, part defiance. I imagined my father's voice calling me a poor artist, and let the echo fade under the weight of what I had built. This mansion, this land, every inch was mine. And yet as I stood before the glowing tree glass in hand, I felt the quiet settle too. There was no one to toast with, no laughter bouncing off the walls, no footsteps in the hallways. Victory felt real, but so did the absence. I had built the table I once dreamed of, but the seats around it remained empty. I took another sip of wine, placed the glass down on the marble counter, and turned off the lights one by one until only the tree remained glowing in the dark. Then I climbed the stairs to the master suite, the silence following me, heavy but steady, as if to remind me there was still more to come. In early 2024, an article ran in the Denver Post about Mitchell Design and Build. The headline read, "Young Designers Revitalize Colorado Neighborhoods," and my photo filled half the page. I was standing in front of a finished property blueprints rolled under my arm, the caption calling me a rising architect, shaping the city's future. I kept the paper folded on my desk for a week before tossing it in a drawer. By then, I knew the ripple had already reached Texas. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years dropped the article into the Mitchell family group chat. Within minutes, my phone buzzed with notifications. Screenshots made their way to me. The comments were predictable. "At least she found steady work. Looks like she finally got her act together." They all assumed I was a mid-level employee lucky enough to be photographed. None of them guessed the company was mine. The messages started soon after. A text from an aunt, "Merry Christmas." "Clara, we miss you." A voicemail from an uncle I barely remembered, "Your grandma would be proud. We should catch up sometime." I read them without answering. Every word felt rehearsed, a script written for the sake of appearances. If they had truly missed me, it wouldn't have taken a decade and a newspaper article to say so. Meanwhile, news about Victoria filtered through the same back channels. She and her husband were in the middle of a bitter divorce in Austin. Rumors spread that the fight over assets was messy, the lawyers expensive, and her perfect facade cracking. I heard she'd moved back into our parents' house for a while. Even then, she was still the favored daughter, the one everyone circled to protect. I didn't celebrate when I heard it. I just noted the timing. Families only turn outward when the inside begins to collapse. One evening in December, I was reviewing designs at my kitchen island when my phone buzzed with a number I hadn't saved. The message was short. "Hope you're doing well. Dad." I stared at the screen for a long time, the glass of water in my hand untouched. 10 years of silence, and this was what broke it, a 6-word text. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The meaning behind it was plain. They had ignored me when they thought I had nothing. Now that they believed I had something they wanted a way back in. I set the phone face down and went back to my drawings, a half smile tugging at my mouth. I knew then it was only a matter of time before the knock came at my door. Christmas Eve of 2025. I set the long dining table in the great hall of my house in the foothills outside Denver. Sam carved the turkey, Julia pulled pies from the oven, and Marcus uncorked a bottle of wine we'd been saving since our first project closed. The fire crackled in the hearth, the tree glowed behind us, and for once, I felt like the holiday wasn't an echo of what I'd lost, but something new I'd built. The doorbell rang sharp and unexpected. Sam glanced at me. "You expecting anyone else?" I shook my head, wiped my hands, and walked to the entry. The security screen showed a cluster of familiar faces at the gate. My father, Richard, my mother, Margaret, my sister, Victoria, with a tall man I assumed was her boyfriend, and a few relatives I hadn't seen in more than a decade. They stood bundled against the cold, shifting awkwardly, their breath rising in the night air. I opened the door without a word. For a moment, no one moved. Their eyes darted past me into the house. "Vamos." Richard finally cleared his throat. "Well, aren't you going to let us in?" I stepped aside. They filed through their gazes, climbing the vaulted ceiling, sliding across the polished wood floors, lingering on the chandelier overhead. I caught the muttered comments as they set down coats and gift bags. "Pretty nice place. Looks staged. Probably rented." Margaret ran her hand along the banister, whispering to an aunt. "Maybe the company put her up here like a perk." Victoria gave a small, skeptical laugh. "No way she affords this on her own." I didn't bother correcting them. I led them into the living room where Sam, Julia, and Marcus stood with plates in their hands. Introductions were stiff, polite smiles that didn't reach the eyes. My relatives' attention kept drifting back to the furniture, the art on the walls the size of the windows. We sat. Plates were passed, glasses filled. Conversation stayed shallow, circling weather, the drive up the mountain Denver traffic. Underneath it, I felt their unease, the way they kept testing the edges of the room, trying to place me in a box that no longer fit. Richard finally leaned back in his chair, fork dangling from his hand. He looked around once more, then fixed his eyes on me. His mouth curled in the familiar half-smirk I remembered from childhood. Still a poor artist, huh? The words landed the way he meant them to. Sharp, dismissive, a reminder of my place. The room went quiet. Even the fire seemed to hush. Sam's hand froze halfway to his glass. Julia's eyes flicked toward me. I felt every eye in the room waiting, measuring what I would do. Instead of answering, I let the silence stretch. I set down my fork, folded my hands, and smiled, not wide, not forced, just enough to make them wonder what I knew that they didn't. Richard shifted, clearing his throat again. Margaret pretended to fuss with her napkin. Victoria looked away. They expected me to defend myself, to shrink, to argue. I gave them nothing. I wanted them to sit with their assumptions, to feel the weight of how wrong they were. The laughter from earlier dinner chatter didn't return. The only sounds were knives against plates, the faint pop of the fire, and the wind rattling faintly at the windows. I lifted my glass, took a slow sip, and set it back down, letting them stew in their own disbelief. And I smiled again, quiet, patient, while they drowned in the lie they had chosen to believe. After the silence stretched too long, Margaret tried to rescue it. She leaned forward with a practiced smile. "Clara, it's been so many years. You look well. How's work? Still busy with that design firm?" I nodded once, letting her think what she wanted. Richard cleared his throat, eyes darting to Victoria beside him. She looked thinner than I remembered, her hand resting nervously on the arm of the man at her side. He introduced himself as Daniel. His handshake was too firm, his smile too polished. Margaret finally said what they had rehearsed. "Your sister is going through a hard time, the divorce. Well, you can imagine how expensive the lawyers are these days. We're just trying to keep things steady." Daniel cut in, his voice louder than it needed to be. "She's been under a lot of stress, but you've done well for yourself, haven't you? Working for that company, Mitchell Design and Build, that's impressive. I'm sure you have some savings put away, helping family when they need it. That's what matters." The words hung there like a demand dressed up as flattery. I leaned back, laced my fingers together, and looked around the room. Richard avoided my gaze. Margaret's smile trembled at the edges. Victoria stared at her lap. Without saying anything, I reached for the leather case beside my chair and pulled out my tablet. The screen lit up, reflecting in their faces. A few taps brought up the year-end report. Charts and numbers filled the display. I turned it toward them. $50 million in revenue last year, I said calmly. Solid growth, consistent profits, a reserve fund larger than most firms in this city. Margaret blinked. You have access to those numbers?" "Of course," I answered. "I wrote them." I swiped to the next file. Photos appeared of the children's hospital wing we had rebuilt with company funds, doctors cutting a ribbon, families smiling beside new equipment. I swiped again, scholarship recipients in work boots holding certificates, faces proud, grateful. "I fund these projects every year," I said, "because opportunity should go to people who know what it's worth." For the first time, Daniel didn't have a quick line ready. He stared at the screen, jaw tight. Victoria's knuckles whitened as she gripped her napkin. Richard's smirk had vanished. He studied the numbers as if they might rearrange themselves into something less threatening. I let the silence stretch, the only sound the faint crackle of the fire behind me. Then I said it clear and steady. "I don't work for Mitchell Design and Build. I founded it. I own it. And this house, it's mine." The words landed like a hammer. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Victoria shook her head slowly, as if refusing to accept what she heard. Richard leaned back, searching for something to say, but finding nothing. All at once the doubt drained from their faces, replaced by a stunned quiet. For years they had written me off as the poor artist, the failed daughter. Now the proof glowed in front of them, undeniable. I set the tablet down on the table and folded my arms. No one moved. The room was heavy with the weight of truth, and I watched each of them struggle to carry it. For a few seconds no one spoke. Then Margaret broke the silence with a nervous laugh. "Clara, this is incredible. We always knew you had talent. Didn't we, Richard?" My father gave a stiff nod, eyes still fixed on the tablet as though it might disappear if he stared long enough. "Of course," he muttered. "We always believed in you." Victoria forced a smile, her voice thin. "You've done so well for yourself. We couldn't be prouder," Daniel added quickly. "Exactly. Families should celebrate each other's success." The sudden chorus of praise filled the room sharp and false. I let it run a moment before I leaned forward, my voice low but steady. "You always believed in me. Then tell me where you were the last 10 Christmases. Who saved me a seat at the table?" The words landed heavy. Richard's head dropped. Margaret blinked rapidly, tears forming. I continued. Not a single invitation, not one card, not one phone call. Every year I sat alone while you raised glasses to each other. Do you remember, Mom, the year you had surgery? I drove 4 hours to see you, flowers in my hands, money in an envelope to help with the bills. And what did you tell the nurse, that I wasn't immediate family? I sat in the hallway like a stranger. Margaret covered her face, shoulders shaking. I turned to Victoria. "And your wedding. I found out through photos online. The whole family smiling, champagne toasts your perfect day. My name never crossed your lips. Do you know what it's like to learn your sister got married from a Facebook album?" Her cheeks flushed deep red. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. I looked back to Richard. "And every time you called me a failed experiment, every smirk, every dismissal, I built this company with the words you threw at me still ringing in my ears." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, trying to interrupt. "Now wait." I raised a hand, silencing him. "You don't get to lecture me on family. You weren't there. You don't know what I carried." His mouth closed, his jaw tight. The fire popped behind us, the only sound in the room. I let the silence stretch before I stood my chair, scraping lightly against the floor. I pointed toward the 12-foot tree glittering in the corner. "This house, this table, this tree, I built them. They are not a bank for you to withdraw from. They are proof that I survived without you." The words cut through the room. Richard pressed his palms to his knees, unable to look at me. Margaret's tears ran freely. Victoria stared at the floor, her face burning. Daniel sat stiff, swallowing hard, but silent. Across the table, my grandmother Rose lowered her gaze. She didn't defend anyone, didn't protest. Her silence was heavier than words, her eyes filled with a sorrow that said she understood the truth too late. No one spoke after that. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall as I stood over them. The weight of everything we had left unsaid, finally laid bare. At last I straightened, walked to the front door, and opened it wide. The cold Colorado air swept in. No one argued anymore. Richard stood first, his shoulders slumped, eyes fixed on the floor. Margaret clutched her purse with trembling hands, avoiding my gaze. Victoria rose slowly, face pale, her lipstick smudged at the corner of her mouth. Daniel moved behind her without a word. They filed out one by one, coats pulled tight, the crunch of their shoes against the stone walkway breaking the silence. At the gate, my father glanced back as if to speak, but nothing came. My mother gave me a long look. Her lips parted, then lowered her head and kept walking. I closed the door behind them with a steady hand. The click of the latch echoed louder than any argument we had ever had. For a moment I leaned against the door, breathing in the stillness. The house was mine again. The chandelier still glowed above the fire, still burned, the tree still sparkled. None of that had changed. The only thing gone was the weight of their presence. When I returned to the dining room, Sam raised his glass. Julia and Marcus followed, their faces lit by the fire. Sam grinned. Well, that was something. But you know what? We're still here. And we're not going anywhere. I sat down with them, the tension slipping from my shoulders. The wine tasted warmer, the laughter easier. Julia leaned over and said, "Clara, this right here is family." Marcus nodded. "We've built everything together. You don't need their approval." I looked around the table at the people who had stood with me through late nights, busted pipes, roofs that nearly collapsed. They had seen me covered in dust, sleeping on plywood floors, eating takeout by flashlight. They were still here now, not for what I owned, but for who I was. My eyes drifted to the tree in the corner, the same kind of tree I used to stare at through other people's windows. Now it stood in my house, glowing with the reflection of everything I had built. The voice inside me was steady as I thought, family isn't blood. Family is presence. It's loyalty. See, it's who shows up when the work is hard and stays when the room is quiet. After 10 Christmases left out in the cold, I had finally found mine. I raised my glass and spoke softly, more to myself than anyone else. Here's to a new kind of family. As we clinked our glasses together, I felt the chapter of exile close behind me. The past would always exist, but it no longer defined me. The house stood tall. The company thrived, and around this table sat the people who mattered. So tell me, what about you? Have you ever been shut out, betrayed, or forced to find family somewhere unexpected? Share your story, because sometimes the ones who stand with you aren't the ones you were born to, but the ones you choose.